The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Now that we've had a little bit more time to review Donald Trump's Attorney General William Barr's 4-page summary of the Mueller investigation, we're starting to get a sense of the full scope of the absurdity and dishonesty of it. And we're going to go through it in some detail today. Now, later, I will let you know, I guess I'm letting you know now, but we'll get into it in more detail, that the Republican Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has already blocked a resolution to release the full Mueller investigation report. And this is one data point that is increasingly illuminating what it is that is taking place here. There's an attorney and professor at University of New Hampshire named Seth Abramson, who put together a really great Twitter thread down to the fine grit detail of how William Barr's 4-page Mueller investigation summary is essentially a total scam or sham, use whichever or both words that you want. And to really understand this, we do have to get into some detail, and I'm going to do my best to sort of ballpark it for you and then give you some specific examples, because I want everybody to understand it. I don't want people's eyes to glaze over, but I also want to do it in a way that doesn't ignore the detail. So William Barr put out a 4-page document, the first page of which we're putting on the screen for our audience. And one really important thing to understand is that Donald Trump's Attorney General William Barr published not a summary of the investigation. William Barr published a summary of the investigation. Now, you might be saying, David, you're already sort of losing me here. What I mean by that is that Robert Mueller did the investigation, which includes all sorts of raw evidence, case files, testimony, pages and pages and pages of evidence. Robert Mueller then wrote a report, a summary, we could call it, which he sent to William Barr. Presumably, Mueller sent both the case files, meaning all the data and the evidence, as well as his summary to William Barr. He might not have, but let's assume that he did. William Barr summarized the summary, not the evidence, and included just pieces of 4 sentences from Robert Mueller's summary of his own investigation. Okay, so it's a summary of a summary rather than a summary of the full investigation data. Why do we care about that? The reason we care is because Robert Mueller's summary is only about decisions made either to prosecute or not to prosecute without the further underlying evidence. So I'll give you an example to try to make this crystal clear. Robert Mueller's summary of the investigation could say, based on all the evidence about obstruction, I decided I could not prosecute Trump, but I also cannot exonerate him. Fine. However, if we looked at the raw evidence from the investigation, it might indicate that Robert Mueller had, for example, 80% of what he needed to prosecute Donald Trump for obstruction. Mueller gives Barr a summary which says, I didn't have enough to indict on obstruction. You might need 95% to indict on obstruction. But Barr, because he's summarizing a summary, says merely that there was not evidence to indict for obstruction, and implies that there was not any evidence that Donald Trump obstructed justice. It's tricky wording, so many people simply don't notice the difference, but it's extraordinarily important. The strategic decision that William Barr made, and he has a lot of experience in this, as an article from Tom Hartman tells us, which we'll deal with later on in the program, Barr made the strategic decision to summarize the summary because it will foment the idea of it's very binary. Was there collusion or wasn't there collusion? Is the president exonerated or is the president not exonerated? And if we actually saw the full case file, we would almost certainly see a ton of evidence supporting criminality by Donald Trump and associates on many fronts, but likely not enough for Mueller to independently make the decision to prosecute. There's a sort of analogy that we could imagine with burglary. Imagine that Robert Mueller was hired to investigate burglary. And if you look at his raw case file that lists all of the evidence, he might say, okay, the alleged burglar was in the location, was spotted in the location at the time, and the alleged burglar was previously someone who had provided a service. It was the cable guy at the house that was ultimately burglarized, and the burglar was caught with some piece of paper that looks like it came from the house that was burglarized, but I ultimately can't prove this beyond a reasonable doubt because the surveillance footage doesn't show the burglar. If Mueller summarizes that, Mueller would say, I am unable to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual committed the burglary. If Barr comes in and summarizes the summary, you can imply that there was no evidence whatsoever, when in fact, as I've just described to you, there was evidence, but not enough to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that an indictment was relevant. Let me give you another example of a really important semantic game that William Barr plays here. If you look at the last paragraph of page 1 of Barr's summary, it says that the special counsel thoroughly investigated allegations of conspiracy with the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election. And later it says that they didn't find evidence of that. This is an important vocabulary distinction. Mueller was not meant to investigate merely conspiracy. If you go back to the appointment of the special counsel, and we're putting that up on the screen, which outlines exactly what the special counsel is supposed to be doing, it says very clearly under paragraph B, subsection 1, that the special counsel is investigating any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. Let's go back to the Barr report again. The Barr report, as written by William Barr, references only investigating conspiracy. Conspiracy is only one way in which there could be coordination or links, and it's way narrower than the full scope of what Robert Mueller was looking at. And once again, because William Barr is summarizing Mueller's summary and not the evidence, all of the possible evidence for links and for coordination simply aren't mentioned by Barr. Barr says conspiracy was investigated. That means agreements of some kind for illegal purposes. You could have links, you could have coordination and still not have conspiracy. Barr is being deceptive by being overly specific, which is a common way that people can obfuscate underlying evidence. And as Seth Abramson says, Barr is adopting Trump's very specific definition of collusion, the narrowest possible definition, referring only to the crime of conspiracy, and says there wasn't evidence of that which justified an indictment. This is a sham, okay? Now, let me give you another example of how wacky we now recognize this 4-page report to be. Barr starts to mix and confuse legal language, which sounds sort of innocuous to the average layperson, but it's not, okay? In the same paragraph of his report, Barr says that Mueller did not find that the Trump campaign conspired with or coordinated with Russia. But then when he quotes from Mueller's summary, says the investigation did not establish that members of Trump's campaign conspired. Establish is a term with a very specific legal meaning. Establish with enough evidence to justify an indictment or to indicate that a particular crime has been committed. Did not find, which is Barr's language, suggests 0% evidence if you look at the underlying case file that Mueller has. Whereas did not establish could mean 50% proof, could mean 60% proof, could mean 80% proof. It could be anything short of what you would need for an indictment, sort of beyond reasonable doubt. These are legal games that Barr is an expert in playing, which we're going to get to later. He has a long history of this. There's much more. I couldn't possibly cover all of it in one segment or even in one show. So in the description to the YouTube clip for this story, we're linking to Seth Abramson's tweet thread. Bottom line, the report is a sham. Every hour that goes by, we learn more about the ways in which it is a sham. And to be clear, I've been saying it for more than a year. We actually have a phone call I got a year ago, which we'll play for you tomorrow, to prove that I've been saying it for more than a year. This doesn't mean that Donald Trump personally colluded with Vladimir Putin. We were never expecting that. What it tells us is that William Barr's summary of Mueller's summary is an absolute and total joke, playing a lot of the very common legalese games that people try to play when they want to either widen the scope to their advantage or narrow the scope to their advantage. Depending on the circumstances, one can be more advantageous than the other. And most importantly, if the actual underlying evidence, case files, and report from Mueller truly exonerate Trump, release the report, which Mitch McConnell has already blocked, as I will tell you about later on in today's program. Let me know your reaction and your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Much more on this coming up.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is David Solomon. David, thank you so much for being a paid subscriber to the David Pakman Show. This is how the show exists. This is how the show is distributed at no charge to 200 community radio and television stations. It's all because of membership. So I really appreciate David Solomon, who is our newest member of the day. Also want to say thanks to Stephen Reeves, who's been with us much longer than David. Stephen's actually been a member almost 5 years and is today's sustaining member of the day. Thanks to both David and Stephen. Please join them if you've got a couple bucks a month to support media that you find valuable. Please go to www.joinpakman.com and sign up. Membership options are very inexpensive. You get great member perks, including the daily members-only bonus show. And if you want to save money off of the already very reasonable normal prices, apply the coupon code THISIS2020 to the membership of your choice. It will save you 40%. Okay, so Donald Trump and people around him and right-wing media have been very quick to say the Mueller report fully exonerates Donald Trump. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what the Mueller report actually does because it's not been released. What we have, the only thing we have at this point, is Trump's Attorney General William Barr has summarized Robert Mueller's summary of the investigation. We're several levels removed, and the last level, William Barr's report, is a very politicized level, as we talked about at the top of the show. So if in truth the full report from Robert Mueller and all of that underlying evidence would exonerate Donald Trump, release it. Let's get a look at it. If Barr's summary of Mueller's summary exonerates Trump, and Mueller's summary also exonerates Trump, then the full investigation's case file must really exonerate Trump. And yet, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is already blocking a resolution to release the full Robert Mueller report. We didn't even have to wonder if Mitch McConnell would do this because he already has. This wasn't even a binding resolution. This didn't even have a date certain on it. It was a non-binding resolution to publish the full Mueller report at some point in time. And Mitch McConnell has blocked it from even coming to a vote in the Senate chamber. It passed the House unanimously, okay, 420-0 with some abstentions there. Trump said it wouldn't, quote, bother him at all to have the report released. William Barr says he needs time to decide if and what should be made public. But the resolution doesn't even say how quickly it needs to happen. They could pass the resolution and Barr could still get the time he claims to need. He could look it over, and yet Mitch McConnell still is not allowing the Senate to vote on it. How was William Barr, by the way, able to decide in under 48 hours that Trump shouldn't be charged with obstruction on the basis of Mueller's report, but he needs more time to decide whether the report can even be released? Mitch McConnell says that there are some security concerns with releasing the report. And he's right in a sense. If we see the full report, we might realize that William Barr is working for Trump here, not for the American people. And that would actually be a pretty serious security concern. And it's becoming very quickly clear, Pat, that Mitch McConnell obviously doesn't want the full scope of the investigation to be known. The most likely scenario here is that while on a lot of these issues, Mueller genuinely felt as though he didn't have what he needed to indict, that there is significant damaging evidence against all sorts of people in Donald Trump circles. That's the obvious reason why everybody would be behaving in exactly the way that they are behaving. And the only question is, will we ever see that report? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I certainly don't buy the national security excuse coming from Mitch McConnell. But I would give a word of caution here because we know McConnell to be a very clever politician. It's entirely possible that he knows what's in the report. And it doesn't tell us too much more than what we got from the William Barr summary. And it's potentially possible that what McConnell is trying to do here is to get Democrats to expend all of their political capital on making sure that the full report gets released. And once the report is released, if it doesn't tell us too much more, then Democrats don't look so good. So I would watch out for that.
Well, I told you earlier already. William Barr summarized Mueller's summary of the investigation, which deliberately excludes, by definition, any issues where damaging evidence was found but fell short of the requirements for an indictment. But we already sort of know that it doesn't actually exonerate Trump, because one of the 4 Mueller quotes that Barr did include in his summary was that Mueller's investigation does not exonerate Trump on the issue of obstruction. And you're absolutely right, Pat, that Mitch McConnell plays all sorts of political games, and he plays them quite successfully. Mitch McConnell, outside of people who follow politics, is not particularly well known, but he's been one of the most effective and destructive political forces of the last many years. You might remember that he successfully blocked Barack Obama's Supreme Court nomination, Merrick Garland, long enough for Donald Trump to be elected and eventually choose a justice for the Supreme Court. He blocked multiple attempts to end the government shutdown recently. He refused to sign on to this bipartisan statement back in 2016, which would have condemned Russia for interference in the 2016 election. And now he's preemptively trying to block the release of the Mueller report. Ultimately, we may have to go the route of House subpoenas and reading the full report on the House floor to get it into the record, which can then be published. It could get to that point. I hope that if it does get to it, the House does do that. But you're absolutely right that in the end, we don't know what's in that report. If it truly exonerated Trump in the way that he claims, you wouldn't see so much energy being put already into it not being released. But it would be potentially damaging to Democrats if, when the full case file is released, there's no damaging evidence whatsoever. I find it extraordinarily difficult to imagine that that's the case. One of the sad downsides of these major breaking stories, especially ones that break over the weekend, like the 4-page William Barr summary of the Mueller report, is that they allow, or maybe to say a little more strongly, they actually create a really significant amount of misinformation and disinformation. They distort, they focus people in on irrelevant or misguided lines of reasoning. And to apply that analysis to the Trump Attorney General Barr report, there has been a really specific incorrect focus, which I want to point out today. Most of the reporting so far and all of the vindication claims from the right and even some people on the left have focused on the idea of collusion, but specifically on Trump personally colluding. According to Barr, Mueller didn't find evidence that Donald Trump personally colluded with Russia. Now, on the one hand, it's ridiculous to even suspect for a moment that as a campaign, there was not any kind of coordination or links to Russia. But again, William Barr has very sort of astutely reduced it to conspiracy and applied it specifically to the president himself. And there's clips of me a year ago, which we'll play for you tomorrow, saying, no, this isn't about Trump personally plotting this stuff. This is much more nuanced than that. So that's not surprising. It's obvious. All along, I've been saying anyone who's waiting for video of Trump and Putin planning election hijinks together are waiting for something they're never going to get. This is about Trump as a friend of Russia who's impressed by Putin, has laundered money for Russians. He's looked for deals in Russia. And so it's a lot of looking the other way, being friendly to Russia, letting people around him benefit from Russia's help. So, yeah, Mueller didn't find Trump personally colluded. No one reasonably expected that that would be a finding. But there are two really important things from the summary that William Barr wrote, which are not getting attention. One of them is related to WikiLeaks. The other is related to obstruction. WikiLeaks I already talked about yesterday. To very briefly remind you, deniers on the right and left were very quick to say WikiLeaks was not at all connected to Russian hacking. WikiLeaks had nothing to do with the release of information hacked by Russians from the DNC and from Hillary Clinton. But Robert Mueller, according to Barr's own summary, says that actually they did find that. If you accept Mueller's other conclusions as reported by William Barr, you sort of have to accept the conclusion that WikiLeaks was indeed connected to Russia, but most people have remained silent on that, even people who were very actively denying that over the course of the last year and a half of the investigation. Now, I already dealt with that yesterday. But let me get to the other issue. The biggest issue right now is that Robert Mueller sort of punted the judgment on Trump's obstruction to Trump's own Attorney General, William Barr. This is a problem for a few different reasons. Number one, William Barr has previously stated he doesn't believe a president can be indicted for obstruction, okay? If you have already said that at a systemic level, you don't think a president can be indicted for obstruction, you're not a good arbiter of whether Donald Trump obstructed justice and whether the evidence indicates that Donald Trump obstructed justice. But even more importantly, Barr's specific bias aside for a moment, whether Trump obstructed justice is not actually William Barr's call to make. And if you look at the history of this issue, when a president has obstructed justice, it has been left up to the House of Representatives to adjudicate it, not the Attorney General who was appointed by the president themselves. Remember that Robert Mueller's report, according to Barr, says Mueller was not able to exonerate Donald Trump from obstruction of justice. When Richard Nixon was in a similar situation, the House voted for the Judiciary Committee to investigate for impeachment. They found evidence of obstruction. They found evidence of abuse of power. And what Mueller said is very similar to what was said in the 1974 statement of John Doerr, who investigated Nixon. That's DOAR. Now it's the House that should be adjudicating obstruction, not Trump's own biased attorney general, who has already said before any of the facts were known, you can't indict a sitting president for obstruction. It's not a check and balance, Pat, for the president to select his judge, which in this case is what he is doing by having William Barr, his hand-picked attorney general, get to decide what obstruction means. And if we need any evidence that Barr isn't a fair arbiter, it's that after a year and a half of investigation, Barr was able to decide in under 48 hours that Donald Trump doesn't need to be charged with obstruction.
Well, this is why we have to see the report, right? I want to see what Mueller had on Trump with regards to obstruction of justice. Was it just the stuff that the public already knew about, like him firing James Comey and bullying Jeff Sessions, or does it go beyond that? Once we know, then maybe it is right for the House to take up impeachment proceedings. Nancy Pelosi said before that she's really not interested in that. It may backfire and not help Democrats come the next election. But let's get it all out there, and then we'll be able to decide, Congress will be able to decide whether the president should be impeached for obstruction of justice.
So what should the process be? Barr has given us his opinion, a summary of a summary. Now the House of Representatives should get the full report, and they can decide how to proceed. Now, Mitch McConnell has already blocked the non-binding resolution to get that full report to members of the House and Senate. If there's really nothing there, let it all happen. Publish the report. Stop trying to get Trump's written answers restricted, as has been happening. Let's just make it happen. Let's get it out there. And let's fully exonerate Trump if you actually believe that that's what's going to happen. What we will learn over the next, it could be a few days. The House resolution that was passed, which McConnell blocked, said April 2nd is when they want the report by, but that's not happening. It could be weeks. Could be longer. What we're going to learn is that there is much more to the report than Barr wants us to know, okay? That doesn't mean we're going to find evidence of Trump colluding personally with Russia. I don't even know who was actually suggesting that that's what we were going to get. It was an unrealistic expectation from the beginning, but there is no doubt that Barr's summary of a summary simply does not give us the full scope of what it is that Robert Mueller uncovered. And hopefully, we are going to get full access to that report at some point in time, even if it takes subpoenas from the House of Representatives, reading it out into the congressional record on the open floor of the House to eventually get it transcribed into some kind of format that is intelligible as the underlying Mueller report. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram, at David Pakman Show. And while you're there, follow me at david.pakman. We will take a quick break. Part 2 of my interview with Natalie Wynn of Contrapoints fame is coming up next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation today with Natalie Wynn, a video essayist and progressive commentator with 500,000 subscribers to her YouTube channel, Contrapoints. We're going to continue our conversation about fascism and authoritarianism, and I want to now start to tie in some of your analysis about not only the alt-right now in 2018, 2019, and in sort of recent electoral politics, but also the connection to Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies. Do you think, or let me frame it in this way. When I interviewed white nationalist Richard Spencer, and I said to him, what exactly is it that you expect from Trump? Do you actually expect him to say, down with the Jews or get white people out or whatever? And Richard Spencer, I think, was pretty genuine in that he said, no, we don't have any expectations of that. It's basically that we recognize that more than any other recent president, Trump seems indifferent to, or at least okay, allowing an atmosphere where white nationalism and the resurgence of neo-Nazism sort of has a better shot than it's had. Is that as far as you would go in thinking about the connection of the Trump administration to these movements, or would you actually take it further than that?
I would go further. First of all, I think that that's correct. Like, I think that a lot of the reason that so many people who are white nationalists love Donald Trump is that Donald Trump is very cautious never to sort of intrude too much on their space, to never really condemn directly any of the things they believe. And that leaves room for them always to think that he might secretly be on their side. But more than that, I mean, I think like I've seen white nationalists call Trump like the strongest like symbol of white identity we have. And I think that a lot of that has to do with like the central marketing basically of his campaign, this like build the wall thing. Well, the wall is like almost like a childishly, laughably primitive symbol of like wanting to protect an in-group from an out-group. And I don't think anyone who voted for Trump really cares that much about the physical wall. I think what they care about is the sentiment behind the slogan, build the wall. It means shut outsiders away. It means keep America American, and we know what that means. So I think that it's more than just his silence. It's more than just saying that there are good people on both sides in Charlottesville. You know, it's also the fact that his messaging is kind of the diet version of Richard Spencer's messaging.
So you mentioned a couple of the data points. There's, you know, Mexicans are rapists and criminals, although some I'm sure are good people. There's total and complete shutdown of, as I think he pronounced it, Muslims coming to the United States. What other data points do you look at that are either coded or more overt language that is signaling to these extremist groups?
Well, I mean, attacking Antifa is a pretty obvious one. I think that just his whole campaigning on like America first, make America great again, which is like, I mean, who wants to make America, for what group of people was America better in the past? Like white people. Everyone knows that. I think that all of these things kind of each of his major talking points is in some way laced with an element that is going to be sort of attractive to people who like white nationalism. He did a speech in Poland that I think this must have been the first year of his presidency. And he talks, I think this was Stephen Miller, I think was his speech, but it was, he's talking about, he's like literally just talking about defending the West from the barbarians. It's not even dog whistles anymore. It's like literally what the white nationalists will say.
Are any of the so-called threats that the current sort of alt-right white nationalist Venn diagram group, however it overlaps on any particular day, are any of the threats they claim to be facing even remotely defensible? That of, white genocide is just absolutely outrageous, but the idea of possible loss of some kind of status for so-called European Americans, the invasion of immigration, as they like to describe it. I mean, is there anything that even has like a grain of empirical defensibility?
Well, I do think that for again, the kind of college-age white boy demographic, there is this sense that, that group of people just used to be able to assume themselves as the default. Like they assumed they were going to get jobs because society was going to provide them jobs. That's how they were raised. They were raised to expect that. They were just used to being represented as the default in media. They were used to Star Wars movies where all the main characters are white men or designed to be perceived by white men, And then suddenly there's this huge cultural shift. Suddenly women and people of color and gender and sexual minorities are making demands and asserting themselves and appearing in media and getting jobs. And so there's this loss of the default status, which in some ways it must hurt a little bit. I think that I can understand why it feels like they're losing something. I think they are losing something. I mean, I think it's something that they didn't deserve in the first place and needs to go. And I think they need to recognize that, but I still get why it feels like a loss.
Yeah, so in other words, they may be claiming that a situation that was a level playing field is becoming one in which they are disadvantaged when, if there is a change in status, what accurately seems to describe it would be that what was previously a privileged status may end up with a more level playing field.
Well, there's, a slogan, I guess, that describes it. I can't remember the exact wording, but basically the effect is that to the privileged person, equality feels like oppression.
I think I've seen that. And I think that much more succinctly than I was able to say it sort of sums it up. When it comes to individual extremists, white nationalists, whoever, I'm curious what your sense is of the platforming or interviewing of some of those individuals. So to kind of set it up for you, my audience is very much aware of this. Over the last many years on my program, I have selectively interviewed extremists of different kinds. And usually I apply like a 2 or 3 part kind of test to whether it's a good idea. Number one is, are they and their ideas prominent enough that there would be some value in refuting and exposing them? That would be number one. Number two, do I feel as though I am either prepared enough or could be prepared enough to responsibly platform them such that it doesn't become an opportunity for them to actually propagandize? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, I've made the decision in the past to interview people like Richard Spencer or the Westboro Baptist Church when they were relevant or whoever else. Given all of that I've just said, what's your kind of general philosophy on the providing of a platform, even if it is one that is not an unfettered platform to propagandize to extremists?
Well, I think I basically agree with what you're describing as the sort of tests that you need to go through to decide if it's a good idea. I've been very, very critical in the past of people who have interviewed Richard Spencer, for example, and then just kind of sat there nodding along as he spouts incredibly toxic white nationalist propaganda. So I think it in part has to do with the personality of the interviewer and whether or not you feel that sort of holding your own and keeping this person accountable in front of an audience is something that you can do effectively. So I think that I agree with what you're saying. There's absolutely no point in profiling a dangerous crackpot with no following because you're just going to give them attention. And then if you're going to profile a high-profile person with extremely toxic and dangerous ideas, then you have to be prepared to challenge them and to really, to really ask the very, very difficult questions that they're not, that are going to sort of expose the reality of what that person is saying. So this is not something I do myself, in part because my temperament is not aggressive enough to do it, and in part because I'm a trans woman and my comrades on the left do not tolerate that from me.
Oh, well, okay. So I want to hear more. So you're saying that because of your identity as a trans woman, you feel that other leftists wouldn't tolerate you interviewing extremists at all, or in the way that your personality would lend itself to those interviews?
Well, I think it's just not the role for me. And I think that it's sort of complicated, the reasons why. I mean, one of them has to do with the fact that in order to do it properly, you have to be a little bit combative. To be combative is a masculine posture. And if a trans woman adopts a masculine posture, she always loses.
That's very interesting. And so I'm curious is this something people have said to you and you've made the conscious decision not to do those types of interviews? Or is this sort of something that you've surmised from your observations as to how people react to your channel?
Well, this was something that I kind of went through, a year and a half ago, where basically it was something that was surmised based on people's reactions. Like I had done I didn't really interview people. That was never what I did online. But I would even go on to right-wing platforms and try to be a person who challenged it. Now, maybe some of the objection to me was that people felt I wasn't a strong enough debater, that I wasn't able to really do that responsibly. But it always was a little weird to me that I was accused of platforming people whose platforms I was appearing on.
Yeah, I think I saw a conversation you had with this gentleman named Carl Benjamin, who might be better known to the audience as a Sargon of Akkad. And yeah, I mean, I think, the appearing on other programs also, there's always a question mark around the kind of framing and context in which the conversation will be happening and whether there's kind of a net gain to be had. And I think the calculation's different for everybody in those cases.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't think that as I said, it's complicated. It's not just that I was shut down by other people. I do feel obviously a little bit hurt about that, but I acknowledge that I was not the greatest debater myself. So, but nor was I given the space to develop the skill.
So I'm curious, I mean, aside from individual decisions around platforming of oneself elsewhere or of others on one's platform, what in your mind are the best sort of insulators that allow people to resist the appeal of some of these fascist, authoritarian, alt-right, nationalist type ideas? I mean, is it just as simple as we've got to start teaching critical thinking in middle school, or is there really more to it?
Well, I think it's more than just critical thinking, because critical thinking, well, that involves a lot of different stuff. I mean, sometimes critical thinking is just like how to analyze graphs, how to analyze data.
Sure.
I think that is important, but I think that a lot of times these arguments are so heavily based on sort of an emotional hook that it's really like a statistician would fall for them, because it's not about numbers, it's about feelings. And to me, I think that one of the things that's a protective shield is having some kind of personal connection to people who are likely to be deeply hurt by that politics. So I think that there's a kind of, social isolation. Like, I think that, as a trans person, this is something I experienced a lot on YouTube where, one of the reasons why the right wing has taken to using trans people as this punching bag is that most people don't know a trans person. So people are sort of ignorant. Trans people are confusing. No one gets it. And so we're sort of easy to hate on because no one's going to come to our defense because they don't know enough to come to our defense. And I think that one of the things that I try to accomplish just by being a somewhat high-profile person on the internet is to just be like, hi, I'm here, I'm human, I'm relatable, you don't want to do things that are going to hurt me in politics.
I mean, I agree with you completely, but it's also one of the most depressing realities. And when I see, you hear about Republican senator rethinks view on gay marriage because their son has come out as gay. Okay, great. Count someone who now has taken the correct position, but it's very depressing that only when it affects them in such an acute way do they actually rethink how this is affecting people.
It's depressing how little imagination people have to to be a career homophobe and a politician, to have just never once thought, what if my son was gay? Like, how can you have not thought that?
Yeah, and of course
sad.
the other side of that is, if views that you thought were so logical and correct and deeply held are so quickly changed as soon as you have a personal connection to the issue, maybe that suggests some of your other views aren't as rock solid as you might imagine.
Yeah, it's right. Your views about race, your views about gender, it's I guess misogyny is kind of the one outlier here, because men who know women seem to have no difficulty hating them.
Yeah, that one is different. That is an interesting one.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah.
We have been speaking with Natalie Wynn, who is a video essayist and progressive commentator. Don't miss her YouTube channel, Contrapoints, with 500,000 subscribers. Natalie, I really appreciate your time and you talking to me today.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've reported before on Donald Trump's worst days of his presidency, and there have been some pretty bad days for Donald Trump. Yesterday might have been Donald Trump's best day ever, and I don't actually mean that because I believe that Robert Mueller's report truly exonerates Trump. In fact, it says that it cannot exonerate Trump from obstruction of justice, but as a result of this vague, politicized summary from Donald Trump's handpicked attorney general, right-wing media went bonkers for 24 straight hours, declaring Trump cleared of any wrongdoing, completely vindicated, even though it's not even his attorney general's call to make that decision on the matter of obstruction, as I've already told you. It doesn't matter, though. The storyline is coherent. The storyline is compelling. Trump has successfully framed himself as the victim, and it's working in that there is now 48 hours of right-wing media going bonkers, titillated and aroused by the idea that Donald Trump has indeed been cleared. So that's really good for Trump already. And then in addition to that, one of Donald Trump's political opponents, one of those pesky political opponents of Donald Trump, attorney Michael Avenatti, who represented Donald Trump's silenced mistress Stormy Daniels, has been arrested yet again. And this time it is federal charges in 2 cases, one in California, one in New York. This includes, most notably, an attempt to extort Nike for $20 million, threatening to release damaging information about Nike if they didn't pay him. Separately, there are also charges against Avenatti for bank and wire fraud, for allegedly embezzling money from a client and filing fake tax returns with the bank. As the story is currently being reported, Avenatti was all set to have a press conference disclosing some scandal involving Nike, and instead he gets arrested for trying to extort them into paying him to cancel that press conference. This is extraordinarily embarrassing. Hypothetically, from all of this stuff together, Avenatti could potentially face 50 years in prison. Unlikely. But the details are stunning, and it's sort of exactly what we would expect from a shady lawyer whose priority all along has been to do what's best for him, to do what aggrandizes him the most. And you and I talked about this before, Pat, when there were rumblings about could Avenatti maybe be the 2020 Democratic nominee. I don't think you thought it was a good idea. I didn't think it was a good idea. And I think at this point, all talk of that has to be dead.
I think so. Especially, it's going to be hard for him to run a successful presidential campaign when he's in prison. Yeah, I mean, no hard feelings about this. I'm not going to lose any sleep that Michael Avenatti is going to be sent to prison. We'll see what goes on ultimately with that case.
And just really good for Trump. I mean, the timing coming on the same day as Trump's "I'm vindicated" sort of right-wing media echo chamber. And Trump's ego is now reinforced. Trump's audacity is going to expand. And like I said yesterday, Donald Trump is quickly barreling towards a big-time reelection if nothing changes. Now, I do want to say one other thing about the Avenatti component to this. As far as Nike goes, I don't know the full details of what was even alleged by Michael Avenatti that Nike was doing wrong. It's very possible that Nike is involved in some insanely shady stuff, which may or may not have to do with the college admissions scandal. I read one suggestion that that's maybe what it was connected to. These are just rumors at this point in time. That's all they are, just rumors. I hope that ultimately, if there is something to learn about what Nike is doing, that we learn about it. Avenatti's a shady character. He shouldn't run for president. We'll see if he ends up spending time in prison as a result of all this. There's no question about that. But it's totally plausible that Avenatti did uncover some kind of shady or possibly corrupt or even criminal behavior on behalf of Nike. It's just a huge corporation that is not immoral but amoral, and these corporations very often engage in behavior that can be criminal or at minimum unethical. And if that's the case, I want to know about it, whether we hear about it from Michael Avenatti or someone else. Threatening them with a pay me or I will go clean, come clean with this, go public with it, is not the right way to go about it. But if indeed Nike has been involved in shady stuff again, and I say again because if you go back 10, 15 years, you know, Nike has been involved in all sorts of shady stuff. I do hope ultimately we learn what it is. And I think it's important for us not to ignore the fact that there may actually be serious allegations here related to Nike. And if there are, I hope we at some point hear about them, not from someone saying, give me 20 million or 2 million or whatever it was Avenatti wanted here. Okay, our friend Tom Hartman from the Tom Hartman program has a really interesting article that he's written about Donald Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, and how his role with regard to the Mueller probe is very similar to his role in other historical events related to possible wrongdoing by presidents of the United States. To set it up, William Barr was hired for a specific reason by Donald Trump. Okay, Donald Trump had a plan which included the interim installation of Matthew Whitaker to give Donald Trump time to find the right person to put in as Attorney General who would be beneficial in terms of their worldview to Donald Trump in the context of the Mueller probe. Okay, that person was William Barr. William Barr said more than a year ago that the president, a president, cannot be indicted for obstruction. So very clearly, this is the guy that Donald Trump wanted, and that's the reason why Donald Trump wanted him to be Attorney General. What we're now learning is that William Barr actually has a long track record of covering up crimes, and he's really good at it. And we learned this thanks to a great article from Tom Hartman, who wrote yesterday this piece called Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr has a history of cover-ups, and he just struck again. William Barr was Attorney General back in 1992, and he was known at the time in some circles not as the Attorney General, but as the cover-up general. That's what William Safire called him at the time. He buried evidence of George H.W. Bush's involvement in Iraqgate. He buried evidence related to Iran-Contra. He resisted the appointment of special counsels multiple times successfully, to the point that his name was even being mentioned as someone who is not just involved in covering it up, but was so potentially corrupt that William Barr maybe should even be investigated for his involvement in those cover-ups. And people often talk about the founding fathers and the intentions of the founding fathers, and we're actually working on a long-form piece about that. A president that cannot be indicted, period, would not be the type of immune president that the founding fathers would have wanted when they framed the system of law and constitution of the United States of America. A president who can appoint their attorney general to declare whether they are innocent or potentially guilty of crimes, including obstruction. That's not the type of presidential immunity that the founding fathers would have wanted when they established how the United States would function. And so Barr has simply struck again. Barr has now cherry-picked a summary of Robert Mueller's investigation. We all knew when William Barr was selected by Donald Trump exactly why he had been selected, and it worked. I mean, we don't even, people are some people are reacting, not all, but some people are reacting in the email to me as if it's this big shock how this thing all went down. You have Trump managing the investigation the way he did, and then in comes Barr and everything goes down. And now all of a sudden we're shocked that it's up to Barr to decide whether Trump obstructed justice, and lo and behold, he decided that he didn't after putting out a very political and carefully worded 4-page summary of a summary. Why are you shocked? This is exactly the job that William Barr was hired to do by President Donald Trump, and he did it. And the really important question that Tom Hartman asks in this article about William Barr, and I'll read from it, he says, quote, "The question this time is whether Congress will be as compliant as they were in 1993 and simply let it all go. Both Trump and senior Republican leadership are already calling for a repeat of 1993. What remains to be seen is if the press and Democratic leadership will go along like they did back then." Tomorrow, I am going to tell you and really focus in on the atrocious media job that was done reacting to William Barr's 4-page summary. And I think that Donald Trump is exactly right. It remains to be seen if the press is going to allow the exact same thing to happen now with Donald Trump and William Barr and the Mueller investigation as what happened back in 1993 with George H.W. Bush. If the first 48 hours of reaction, of course from conservative media, but also from plain old centrist corporate media, also from some enclaves of leftist media, it has been disgusting. The reaction we have seen from media outlets of all kinds, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. And if things don't change with media coverage of this report, and if we don't start getting some actual down-to-earth analyses of what the report does mean and doesn't mean, I'm at least trying to do it, but I can't do it alone. This is going to go exactly the same way as it did in 1993. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. The voicemail line this month is made possible by our friends over at Linguist, who want to help you take your language learning to the next level. I've been using Linguist myself to brush up on my French in advance of very interesting work project I have coming up in France. I love it because it uses AI to adjust to your exact skill level. I've taken French before. I don't want to sit there wasting my time going over stuff I already know, and that's exactly what Linguist prevents me from having to do. Please try it out free. No credit card needed. Linguist.com/Pacman. Linguist with a V.com/Pacman. Okay, today's voicemail. You might remember the Kansas troll. The Kansas troll, an extraordinarily racist caller to the show. He has face planted on our program. He's face planted on Sam Cedars' program, The Majority Report. Today, we got a call from the San Antonio troll. Okay, the San Antonio troll has been missing for a while. And the San Antonio troll does something very similar to the Kansas troll, which is they call up and they criticize me for things I've never talked about. I don't know if they're hearing this stuff on other shows. I don't know if they're just trolling. But after, I think it's been like a year or longer without hearing from the San Antonio troll, he resurfaces and slams me brutally for something I've never even spoken about on the show.
Hey, Pac-Man, how's it going? Quick question. You often bring up Karl Popper's intolerance of intolerant will eventually lead to the downfall of the tolerant, blah, blah, blah. Now, since you're such an expert on Karl Popper, maybe you could answer this. Is Karl Popper's solution to the intolerant to debate the bad ideas, or is his solution to ban anyone who isn't pro-Democrat, like you propose? That's all, Pac-Man. Just a quick question. All right, bye-bye.
Word salad aside, I don't think I've ever mentioned Karl Popper on this program. I'm not an expert in Karl Popper. My exposure to Karl Popper is mostly limited to, I believe, Nassim Nicholas Taleb writes about Popper in his book, The Black Swan. And maybe Daniel Kahneman has written about Popper, but I am no expert on Popper. I would be shocked if his name has even been mentioned more than in passing once or twice on this program. I have no idea what you're talking about. Must be some other show you're referring to. Maybe you got your speed dial messed up and you were meaning to call, I don't even know, Sam Cedar or Kyle Kalinske or Cenk Uygur or somebody else. But you got to do better, San Antonio troll, to come out of the woodwork after a year with that horrible nonsense voicemail. Disappointing. I would have expected better from him. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Although ISIS may be out of territory, they still have a bunch of money. And we will talk about what impact that could have. We will also talk about the Supreme Court looking again at partisan redistricting. And we have follow-up from the Australian teen who egged an Australian senator. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get access by becoming a member or a patron, and I will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.